Hey everyone, and welcome back. I'm Rick Fussell and this is the Ingrain Workshop. So I have an upcoming project that's going to require me to cut some tongue grooves on some drawer fronts and some door fronts. So in today's video, I'm going to be building a tenoning jig for my table saw. That's coming up next here at the Ingrain Workshop. Alright, let's get started. First up, we're here at the table saw. I'm going to clean up the edge of a piece of 3/4 inch plywood. Then I'll cut it to the exact width of the top of my table saw fence plus a 32nd of an inch. Why? Because we want this thing to slide smoothly. A top rail that's too tight is like trying to shove an elephant through a keyhole. Not going to happen. Next, I'll measure the height of my fence and cut a piece that's fence height plus 3/4 of an inch. This will make sure everything fits together nicely. I'll dry fit it all and make sure those jig rails slide along the table saw fence like butter on a hot skillet. Now the width of the side and top rail will depend on your specific fence. Now the side rail that's next to the saw blade, I made mine 10 inches wide. This is the side that will accept the different types of jigs we add to this table saw fence rail. Now it's time to head on over to the miter saw to cut all the pieces down to a final length of 20 inches. Precision is key here, or at least close enough that no one notices. Back at the table saw, I'll dry fit everything and shim up the top rail using a playing card. Yep, you heard me right, a playing card. It's about a 32nd of an inch thick and perfect for reducing friction. Trust me, this trick works better than borrowing your neighbor's butter knife. I'll do the same shim trick with the side rails, but later in the video I'll add nylon screws to fine-tune the friction and really dial in the rails. With everything dry fit, I'll temporarily hold it together using some trusty brad nails. Think of it as the jig's training wheels. Then I'll pre-drill, countersink, and screw it all together with 1.5 inch GRK screws. And voila, the jig guide now slides silky smooth along the table saw fence. Reminisce of Michael J. Fox in Back to the Future. You could practically call it a hoverboard for woodworkers. Next, I'll use a 3/4 inch Forstner bit to countersink a hole in the jig, followed by a 5/16 inch through hole to install a handle. And no, I'm not going to drill through my outfeed table. This isn't a demolition project, but I do sense an outfeed table project on the horizon. The handle step is optional, but hey, I had one laying around and I don't tolerate slackers in my workshop. A jig with a handle? That's a luxury item, my friends. Now let's dive into building the jig itself. I'm starting with 3/4 inch plywood, sturdy, reliable, and still light enough that it won't double as a workout session. Over at the table saw, I'm cleaning up the edges and cutting it down to a final size of 20 inches by 20 inches. I'm using pre-finished plywood for that slick, friction-reducing surface. And since I have some leftover black Formica from my red maple cabin kitchen project, I figured why not use it? It's like giving the jig a tuxedo. Fancy, but totally optional. If you've never worked with Formica, it's surprisingly easy. Just score it a couple times with a box cutter and snap. You'll feel like a magician. I'm cutting the Formica a little oversized by 1/2 inch, and I'll trim it to perfection after gluing it to the plywood. For glue, I'm using contact cement, aka nose tear gas. Seriously, do this outside or like me, open all the doors, windows, and maybe even call a priest. I'm applying it with a cheap wood chip brush. 2 coats, 20 minutes apart until the surface is tacky but not wet. To avoid an accidental permanent bond, I'm placing thin plywood strips between the Formica and the plywood. Starting in the middle, I'll bond the surfaces, working my way out and removing the spacers as I go. Then I'll grab my J-roller and press it down evenly, like I'm ironing that fancy tuxedo. At the router table, I'm trimming the excess Formica with a flush trim bit. Then with my trim router and a chamfer bit, I'll cut a 1/8 inch chamfer around the perimeter. Now it's time to attach the jig to my table saw fence hoverboard. I'm clamping it to the 10-inch side and making spots for 3 5/16 inch hex bolts. These bolts, paired with knobs, will make it easy to remove the jig later. Using a 1/8 inch bit, I'm drilling through both the jig and the hoverboard, then countersinking with a Forstner bit to hide the hex heads. Then I can drill out the 5/16 inch through hole in the jig and in the slider. With all my through holes drilled out, I can connect the jig to the slider with 3 5/16 inch hex bolts and knobs. So it's really not a tuxedo without a bow tie. So next is the bow tie. We're going to add some T-track. So to maximize versatility, I'm laying out an X pattern. Double-sided carpet tape holds my straight edge in place as a router fence. I also add painter's tape to the Formica to prevent chip out because nothing says professional like preventing unnecessary disasters. With a 3/4 inch straight bit, I make multiple passes to cut the T-track slots. And there you go, a nice bow tie for our tuxedo. At the miter saw, I cut 45-degree angles on the aluminum T-track, and this is where the T-track intersect in the middle of the X. And yes, you can cut aluminum with your miter saw, just don't forget your eye protection unless you enjoy impromptu laser shows. The T-track corners were looking a bit sharp, so I cut 45-degree angles on the jig's corners too. To keep things consistent, I went back to the trim router and chamfered those corners. Then I filed the edges of the T-track, and because my OCD kicked in, I used a simple Sharpie to color the freshly cut ends. Okay, James Bond had his tuxedos and Q's secret gadgets, and our jig is no exception. It's getting its own secret weapon. That weapon? A radius cut that takes this jig from helpful to mission accomplished. This feature will allow us to cut not only mortise and tenons, but also bridal and castle joints. Talk about versatility. To create this cut, I made a simple circle jig for my router using some scrap 1/4 inch plywood. The pivot point, the same 5/16 inch bolt hole we drilled earlier. Yes, it's a bit meta, using a jig to make a jig, but it gets the job done. With a 3/8 inch straight cut bit chucked up in the router, I carefully cut the arch, connecting the top portions of the X layout. Slow and steady is the key here to keep the cut clean and accurate. Q never stopped at just one secret gadget, and this jig follows suit. The next upgrade, nylon toilet bolts to fine-tune the slider's fit to perfection. Now my table saw fence has countersunk bolts holding the HDPE panel to the metal frame. To avoid those pesky fence divots, I'll install the nylon bolts lower on the slider. First, I evenly lay out 4 bolt locations on the slider. Using a 3/4 inch Forstner bit, I drilled the holes to accept the nylon bolt nuts. A little CA glue and some spring clamps later, the nuts were securely glued into place. Next, I needed to modify the nylon bolts to fit my fence setup. At the bandsaw, I carefully cut down the overall length of the bolts and removed the heads. Pro tip, use a spring clamp to hold the bolts. Your fingers will thank you. With the bolts trimmed, I headed over to the oscillating belt sander to round over the end that contacts the HDPE fence, ensuring smooth sliding and flattening the other end to form a makeshift head. Back at the bandsaw, I cut a small kerf into the new head, creating a slot for a screwdriver. For the finishing touch, I polished the contact end at the buffing wheel to reduce friction against the fence. Returning to the table saw, I adjusted the nylon bolts to remove any slack from the slider. A snug fit ensures precision cuts. Off camera, I made a jig fence out of cherry. It's 2 inches wide, rounded at each corner, and then a 5/16 inch hole at the bottom and the top, which allows for a pivot point and then for the rail to ride along the arch at the top of the jig. I like to keep my jigs and sleds organized, so I drilled an 1.5 inch hole through the jig with a hole saw and rounded the edges with an 1/8 inch chamfer. This step is optional, but super handy for hanging storage. Now let's put the jig to work for a traditional tongue and groove joint. At the table saw, I set the fence a 1/4 inch from the blade and adjusted the blade height to 1/2 inch. With my 3/4 inch rails and stiles, I'll make one pass, rotate the piece, and run the opposite side against the fence. This ensures the groove is perfectly centered. A quick test fit with the panel confirmed the groove was spot on. To cut the shoulders on the rails, I'll set the blade height to a 1/4 inch, verified it using the groove, and made the cuts with the miter gauge. For the tongues, I clamped the rail vertically in the jig, setting the blade height to 3/4 inch. I made one pass just at the edge of the groove, flipping the rail. I made the second pass to complete the tongue. A quick fit showed a perfect match between the tongue and groove. Cutting a bridal joint is just as straightforward. Adjust the jig's fence to match the angle of your joint and cut a 1/4 inch groove at the end of the piece. Flip the board and repeat the cut to ensure precision. For the tongue piece, bump the table saw fence outward and repeat the shoulder and tongue cutting process. And there you have it, 2 versatile joints, tongue and groove and bridal, that this jig can handle with ease. You can also make castle joints, which I'll showcase in an upcoming project, so stay tuned. So that's going to wrap up this video. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope it helps you out or gives you some ideas on how you can make a tenoning jig for your table saw. I'll leave links in the video description below to where you can pick up any tools and equipment that I might have used on this project. If you're new to the channel and you like DIY and woodworking projects, then I highly recommend that you smash that subscribe button. It's free and painless, and I'd also ask that you ring that bell icon. That way you'll be notified of all our upcoming videos. To all my existing subscribers, I really appreciate all the support that you're giving this channel. I'm Rick with the Engraving Workshop. Until next time, have a wonderful day and God bless.